The wind had a way of settling into a man's bones out here, like it belonged there. Out on the far edges of New Mexico territory, the land stretched into a quiet so deep it felt almost holy. No townsfolk for miles, just the dry breath of desert wind and the stubborn creak of wood on an old porch. Samuel Blake sat on that porch every evening as the sun sank behind the mesas, a chipped mug in his calloused hand, his eyes tracing shadows that belonged more to memory than to anything still living. At 42, Samuel had grown into the sort of man whose presence didn't need to be loud to be felt. Tall, lean, with skin weathered by sun and sand, he moved like someone who'd learned to carry pain without complaint. His hands were strong but gentle, the kind that could build a fence, break a horse, or bury a dream without letting the sorrow show. People in town used to know him, used to call out when he came in for supplies, but that had stopped some years ago, not long after she died. Now, no one bothered, and Samuel preferred it that way. His days passed with quiet purpose. He rose before dawn, fed the chickens, milked the old brown cow that still gave just enough for coffee and cornbread, and worked his land until his back ached. The fields had grown stubborn, the earth less forgiving with each passing year. But he didn't complain. He didn't talk at all, really. Not since Elizabeth. His wife's name lingered like dust in the corners of the house, on the windowsills, in the empty space beside him at the table, in the way he still reached for her apron when something spilled. She had died of fever 6 winters ago. There had been no doctor to call, no priest to comfort. Just him, holding her hand as it grew cold, whispering promises that came too late. He hadn't spoken a full sentence to another soul since her funeral. Every Sunday, the town down the trail posted government notices on the wall beside the saloon. Most were about stolen cattle, land disputes, or federal taxes, things that didn't concern a man like Samuel, who lived too far and too quietly to matter. But one dusty afternoon, as he watered his horse near the back entrance of the saloon, he overheard 2 men reading something off the latest bulletin. Their voices were loud, half-laughed, half-drunken. "They're auctioning off what's left," the first said. "Tribes cleared out, but a few of their women, one's left behind. They're selling them off to settlers." The other spat into the dirt. "Hell, can't imagine who'd want one of those. Might as well buy a shadow." Samuel didn't turn to look at them. He just kept his eyes on the bucket, on the ripples of water disturbed by his horse's breath. But inside, something shifted. Not outrage, not pity, just curiosity, maybe. Or the ghost of something he hadn't felt in years. A pull toward the unknown. That night, long after the stars had taken their places and the land had gone still again, Samuel lit a single lamp in his cabin. He sat at the small table, the same one he and Elizabeth used to eat at, and unfolded a map that hadn't been touched in months. His finger traced a route east, toward a place near the edge of the old territory line. Tucker's Post, the bulletin had said. An old trading outpost turned government holding site. He stared at the map for a long time. The flame flickered, casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the coyotes howled. Inside, a decision was forming. Not spoken aloud, not even fully thought through. But in his chest, a quiet yes echoed through the silence he'd built around himself like a wall. At sunrise, he saddled his horse. He didn't pack much, just water, bread, a coin pouch with a few crumpled bills and some silver. Before leaving, he paused beside Elizabeth's grave behind the barn. The wooden cross leaned slightly to one side, worn by years of dust storms and desert heat. He didn't say anything. He just touched the top of the cross, a gesture more intimate than any word could have been. Then he turned, climbed onto the saddle, and rode east. The road to Tucker's post was long and jagged, bordered by brittle sagebrush and dry creeks that hadn't seen water in seasons. As he rode, the land changed, less familiar, less forgiving. He passed a caravan heading west, settlers with tired eyes and blistered hands. One woman, wrapped in a shawl, gave him a long look as their wagons crossed paths. Samuel nodded once, the way men do when there's nothing to say but everything to feel. By noon, he saw the trading post. It looked abandoned at first, just a sagging roof and a crooked sign clinging to its nails. But smoke curled from the chimney, and a flag hung limp over the porch rail. Inside, he imagined, would be crates and ledgers, soldiers with clipboards, and women with faces full of stories no one had ever asked to hear. Samuel tied his horse outside and adjusted his hat. The sun glared down, blinding and merciless. He took a deep breath, not knowing exactly why he was here, only that he had come. And maybe that was enough. Maybe silence wasn't just about absence. Maybe it was space. Space for something unexpected to step in. The sun had barely broken the horizon when Samuel arrived at Tucker's post. The landscape around the old trading post was as worn as the building itself. Dry, cracked earth that hadn't seen rain in weeks, and air that carried the scent of old ash and tired leather. The structure, once a busy checkpoint for passing caravans, now leaned into the wind like a man too proud to fall but too broken to stand tall. The windows were smeared with years of dust, and the wooden sign that once read "General Provisions" had been split down the middle, the letters barely legible. 3 horses were tied out front. A rusted wagon creaked as it shifted under the sun. A soldier leaned against the doorframe, smoking a thin roll of tobacco and watching the road like it owed him something. As Samuel dismounted, the soldier didn't move, just flicked the ash off his smoke and nodded in a way that wasn't friendly or rude, just indifferent. The kind of nod men gave when they'd seen too much and felt too little. Inside, the air was heavier. Dust hung in the light beams that streamed through broken shutters. A few men, traders, maybe farmers, maybe worse, stood around a cleared space in the center of the room. To the left, against the wall, sat 3 women. Their clothes were threadbare, their eyes low. No one looked directly at them. It was easier that way. A clerk with thin gray hair and a ledger book stood behind a table, stacked with paperwork. He didn't even glance up as he spoke. "We're clearing out what's left," he muttered, his voice dry and rote. "Territorial order. These women were found unclaimed after the disbandments. Government don't want the cost of transporting them, so we're offering them local." He cleared his throat. "No returns." One of the men chuckled. "Hell, ain't nobody taking them home for keeps." Another leaned in, squinting at the women. "They look like ghosts. You sure they're still breathing?" The room broke into low laughter. Samuel didn't say a word. He stood near the back, his hat casting a shadow over his eyes, arms folded across his chest. He wasn't there to argue, and he sure wasn't there to laugh. The clerk gestured to the first woman. She was older, with sunken cheeks and calloused hands that clenched tightly in her lap. "Starting at $5, he said. One man offered 6, another 7. The bidding ended quickly. She was let out without protest, her eyes locked on the floor the entire time. The second woman was younger. Her hair had been hacked short, and there was a fresh bruise across her jaw. She went for $3 to a man who spat tobacco juice into the dirt as he took her by the arm. No one flinched. No one spoke. Then came the last. She didn't lift her head when they motioned to her. She sat apart from the others, about 10 feet to the side, wrapped tightly in a torn wool blanket. Her frame was small, her skin a deep, sun-weathered brown. Her feet were bare and coated in dust. Her long, tangled hair covered half her face, and the other half was hidden beneath the folds of the blanket. The clerk looked around. This one was found outside Fort Chisholm. No papers, refused to speak. We call her Tiva, but that's guesswork. Anyone? No one stepped forward. Someone scoffed. Probably half crazy sitting like that. Ain't even looking up. The clerk tried again. $1? Silence. He shrugged. Hell, take her off our hands and we'll count it as charity. Still, no hands were raised. Just murmurs, shifting boots, and glances exchanged between men who wanted no part of a silent, nameless woman. Samuel took a slow step forward. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, 2. The word hung in the air like a shot fired from a long way off. Everyone turned. The clerk blinked. $2? He repeated. Samuel nodded once. There was a pause, then laughter. Ugly, dismissive, half-drunk laughter from the men still hanging by the walls. Well, I'll be damned, someone muttered. Didn't think the ghost farmer spoke English. Another man slapped his thigh. Hope you don't mind if she don't answer back, stranger. Sounds like a match made in heaven. Samuel ignored them. The clerk didn't argue. He scrawled something in his ledger, took the 2 coins from Samuel's hand, and gestured toward the girl. She's yours now. Good luck. He walked over slowly. She still hadn't looked up. Her arms clutched the blanket tightly, as if it were the last real thing she owned. Samuel didn't speak. He crouched beside her, not too close, and set a small piece of bread down in the dust. Then, gently, he reached for her arm. She flinched. He didn't tighten his grip. Instead, he paused, letting her feel that his touch wasn't force. It was invitation. After a long, tense moment, she let him help her stand. Her legs were trembling. The blanket slipped slightly, revealing a wrist marred with old rope burns. Still, she said nothing. The laughter had faded now. The other men had lost interest. Samuel led her outside, helping her up into the wagon bed with quiet, deliberate movements. He didn't tie her down, didn't speak. Just handed her a canteen of water and made sure the blanket stayed around her shoulders. As he climbed onto the seat and took the reins, he could feel her eyes on him. Not curious, not grateful, but watchful, measuring him. Like a wild animal, unsure whether it had been freed or caught in a different kind of trap. He gave the horse a gentle tap, and the wagon creaked into motion, leaving behind the trading post, the ledger, the jokes, and the men who would forget this day before sunset. She didn't speak, neither did he. But something had changed in the air between them, something heavy, unspoken, and impossible to take back. The wagon creaked across hard ground as they left Tucker's post behind, the sun slipping westward like a dying ember. Samuel kept his eyes on the trail, but his ears were attuned to every sound from the back. Every movement of fabric, every creak of wood, every breath she took. The woman sat bundled in her blanket, head still lowered, her silence so total it almost changed the sound of the world around them. No birds, no breeze, just the low rumble of wheels and the faint squeal of the reins when the horse pulled too hard. Oh, it was near dusk when they reached his farm. The familiar sight of the crooked barn, the small wooden house, and the lone oak tree by the edge of the fence line greeted him like ghosts, refusing to leave. As he pulled the wagon to a stop, she didn't move. He climbed down, walked around to the back, and waited. Still, she didn't look at him, just stared out toward the hills, as if something out there still held her hostage. He extended a hand, not to pull her, just to offer. After a long moment, she reached forward and placed her hand in his. It was cold, small, and trembling. Without a word, he led her to the barn. The house would have been warmer, but he knew better than to rush that kind of trust. The barn had old hay, thick shadows, and space she could claim as her own, even temporarily. He cleared a corner near the back, laid out 2 heavy blankets, and dragged an old apple crate nearby to serve as a makeshift table. Then he lit a small fire in the rusted pit he hadn't used since last winter, shielding the flames with broken planks to keep the warmth in. She didn't say a word, didn't look around. She just sat down, folded her legs beneath the wool, and fixed her eyes on the dirt floor like it held the story of her life. Samuel returned a few minutes later with food, warm cornbread, jerky, and a tin cup filled with goat milk. He set it down gently on the crate, careful not to startle her. She didn't move for a moment. Then, slowly, she reached for the bread. Her hands shook. She tore a piece and brought it to her mouth, chewing with deliberate quietness. The tin cup clinked softly as she lifted it, her eyes never meeting his. He watched for a minute, then stepped back into the barn's open doorway. The air outside was sharp now, the kind of cold that crept into bones during desert nights. He looked up. The stars were beginning to show, faint pinpricks against the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Behind him, she stirred. He turned. She was sitting upright now, holding the blanket tight around her shoulders. Her hair, though tangled and dusty, caught the firelight in soft waves. She was still a mystery, an outline more than a person, a presence without a name. He noticed her feet. The blanket had shifted just enough to reveal them beneath the edge of her skirt. Bare, scarred, and cracked. Long, deep lines across the tops and soles, like she'd walked for miles over sharp stones. Some wounds looked fresh, others old and cruel. Rope burns circled her ankles. Samuel's jaw tightened. He didn't ask questions, not yet. Instead, he walked back into the house, fetched a tin basin, filled it with warm water from the stove, and returned to the barn. She watched as he set it near her feet, but she didn't move. He took a folded cloth, dipped it in the water, and placed it beside the basin. Then he stood and stepped away, giving her space, not permission, because she hadn't asked for that, but the choice. That mattered more. He didn't stay to see if she used it. He returned to the porch, sat down in his usual chair, and listened to the wind whistling through the slats of the barn wall. The land around him had always been quiet, but tonight it felt different, like something had shifted under the surface, like silence had taken on a shape. He closed his eyes and tried to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. Too many thoughts now, too many pieces moving he couldn't name. Midnight crept in slow and heavy. Samuel stood and walked back to the barn to check the fire. He paused at the doorway, careful not to startle her. The fire still glowed low, casting soft orange light against the walls. She sat near it, her knees pulled to her chest, chin resting atop them. Her face was turned upward now, toward the open slats of the roof where the stars winked through. And then he heard it, a soft, broken sound. She was humming, barely audible, fragile as wind through feathers. A haunting melody, without words, only breath and sorrow, and something older than both. It was not a song he recognized, but it made his chest tighten, like it came from a place even he had forgotten existed. She didn't know he was there. Or maybe she did. Either way, she kept humming. Eyes fixed on the moon above, her voice like a memory that didn't belong to this world anymore. And as he stood there, silent and unmoving, Samuel realized that whatever she carried, whatever name she had lost or hidden, was too heavy to name out loud. She was not a guest, not a prisoner, not yet a friend. She was something else, a story not yet told. The days rolled by like dust across the porch, quiet, steady, and oddly weightless. Morning sun would stretch its arms across the ranch, casting golden shadows on the warped wooden fence, and still she wouldn't speak. Samuel had long since stopped expecting her to. But she moved through the world with intention now. Quiet, yes, but not idle. She started with the kitchen, sweeping out the corners, scrubbing the pans, rearranging the shelves like she already knew where things belonged. Samuel watched, saying nothing, surprised only by how natural it all seemed. As if she wasn't learning the house, but remembering it. By the third day, she began tending the animals. The chickens, wild and mean-tempered, settled around her without fuss. She'd step barefoot into the coop each morning, her skirts dragging in the straw, and collect eggs in the folds like it was second nature. The old cow, which hadn't let anyone near her in months, stood still under her hands. She milked her gently, humming under her breath, not the haunting tune from the barn, but something lighter now, softer. The barn cat even started following her around like a shadow with purpose. Samuel didn't interrupt. He let her be. But something inside him began to ache. Some old part that hadn't stirred in years. He wasn't sure if it was the sound of her humming or the way she moved through his life, like she had always been meant to. But the silence between them no longer felt heavy. It began to feel expectant, like a held breath. Still, there were things he didn't understand. Late one afternoon, he returned from the northern edge of the property, where he'd been repairing a broken fence post, and found her crouched near the barn. She didn't notice him at first. Her fingers were moving through the dirt, not idly, but with purpose, drawing. Samuel stepped closer, quiet as a whisper. The pattern she'd etched was intricate. Circles within circles, jagged lines intersecting with curved ones, dots placed carefully at angles he didn't recognize. He'd seen symbols like that before, long ago, carved into canyon walls and drawn onto hides. Native markings, tribal. But not ones he could read. Not ones the townfolk ever talked about, unless in nervous tones and lowered voices. She looked up then, catching him watching. Her eyes didn't widen in surprise. She didn't flinch. She simply brushed her hand across the dirt, and the drawing vanished under a cloud of dust. Samuel said nothing, just nodded once and walked on. That night, he built a fire outside, under the wide stretch of stars. The kind of fire that didn't ask for company, but welcomed it anyway. She sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of water, her face turned toward the glow. And for the first time, he began to speak. He told her about the land, how he'd bought it young and foolish, believing he could build something permanent in a world that moved like the wind. He spoke of the droughts, the storms, the year the locusts came. Of the day he buried his wife beneath the oak tree, and how the silence in the house afterward had nearly driven him mad. She didn't respond, didn't look up, but she listened. He could feel it in the stillness, the way her body leaned just slightly toward the sound of his voice, like a deer listening from the edge of the woods. Each night after that, he spoke a little more. Stories from his boyhood, tales of his mother's hands and his father's rifle. He talked about the mountain lion tracks he'd once followed too far, and the time he fell through the ice and thought the cold would keep him forever. And each night, she sat and listened, still wrapped in her silence, but somehow closer than before. Then came the seventh night. Samuel had fallen asleep to the usual quiet, the wind in the rafters, the faint shifting of wood, the whisper of her breath from the far side of the barn. But sometime deep in the dark, he woke. The cot beside the stove was empty. The fire had burned low, casting flickers of light against the walls. He stood, grabbing his coat, and stepped outside. The moon hung full and white above the ridge. Everything was still. Not silent, still, as if the land itself was holding back breath. Then he saw her. She stood beneath the oak tree, the one where his wife lay buried. Her back to him, hair loose and tangled, falling past her shoulders like a black river. The wool blanket had slipped from her shoulders, pooling around her feet like shadows. Her arms were raised slightly, palms open to the wind, and she was whispering. He couldn't hear the words, not fully, just soft syllables rising and falling, carried on the breeze, the kind of sound you weren't meant to hear with ears, but with the space between heartbeats. He took a step forward, the ground crunching under his boots. She didn't turn. Samuel stopped. Her voice grew stronger, like the wind itself was listening now. The branches above her swayed, though the air around him stayed still. Her feet were bare again, planted firmly in the grass. He noticed something carved into the earth around her. Faint lines, half hidden in shadow. More symbols, circles, arrows, the same ones from before. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the whispering stopped. She lowered her arms and turned slowly toward him. Her eyes met his, calm, ancient, and unreadable. Samuel didn't speak, neither did she. They stood there, two ghosts under the branches, in the place where things were buried, but not forgotten. And somehow, he knew. This wasn't the first time she had stood beneath that tree. The storm rolled in like a beast, with breath made of thunder and teeth of wind. It came without warning. One moment the sky was pale and stretched wide with quiet. The next, it was blackened with churning clouds that cracked open the sky like a whip. Samuel had seen plenty of storms in his time, but something about this one felt wrong. Not just fierce, but furious. Like the sky was angry, and it wasn't aiming for the horizon. It was coming for the ranch. He had barely reached the barn when the first bolt of lightning split the dark in half, followed almost instantly by a thunderclap that shook the very boards beneath his boots. Rain came down like hammers, pounding the roof until it sang with leaks. One of the beams groaned, old wood protesting the weight of too many years and too much water. She was already there, standing in the doorway, soaked, her hair whipping around her face. No fear in her eyes, just focus. Without a word, she grabbed a bucket and climbed the ladder to the loft, where the worst of the leaks were spilling onto the hay. Samuel followed close behind, tools in hand, gritting his teeth against the wind that screamed through the cracks. They worked in silence, bodies moving in rhythm with each other. Passing boards, hammering nails, wedging cloth in the gaps. The storm rattled the barn like it wanted in. But they held fast. He looked at her, drenched and wild-eyed. And for the first time since she appeared in his life, he saw her not as lost, but as fearless. Then she spoke. "Storm brings spirits." The words were soft, almost devoured by the rain, but they landed in him like iron. Samuel stopped mid-hammer and looked at her. "What did you say?" She didn't repeat it. Instead, she glanced up at the rafters, where the wind whistled like a cry from another world. "They come on wind," she said quietly. on thunder, on fire. He felt something crawl across his skin, not from fear, but from understanding. Like her words weren't strange at all, just old. "What's your name?" he asked. The question heavy with everything he'd been too afraid to ask before. She turned to face him fully then, her face glistening from rain and firelight. "Tiva," she said. "It means dance of fire." The name sat between them like a spark. Samuel nodded slowly, tasting it in his mind. Tiva. It suited her somehow. Wild, flickering, ancient. Like something you couldn't hold without being changed by it. They finished the patchwork repairs and climbed down from the loft. Outside, the wind still howled, but inside the barn, there was calm again. They sat by the fire Samuel had built earlier, flames casting shadows that danced up the walls like restless spirits. Tiva leaned close to the warmth, her eyes reflecting the fire like mirrors to something far older than memory. Samuel took a breath. "Why were you left behind?" he asked. Tiva didn't answer right away. She looked into the fire like she was reading from it. Then she whispered, "Because I knew too much and said too little." Her voice cracked on the last word, not with emotion, but with truth. The kind of truth that had grown roots and refused to rot. Samuel stared at her, unsure what to say. He didn't press. He just waited, knowing if there was more, it would come not by force, but by firelight. And slowly it did. Tiva's words were fragmented, like broken pieces of a mirror too long buried. She spoke not in stories, but in moments, flashes of memory that burned through the silence like sparks on dry wood. She said she came from a people who didn't own the land but listened to it. She said her mother had once walked through fire and come out the other side with visions. She said she was not born to be someone's servant or captive, as some had assumed, but something else entirely. "A messenger," she said, eyes fixed on the flames. "I was meant to carry things, not goods, but words, warnings, names." Samuel felt the air shift again. The fire snapped loudly, as if agreeing. "Messages for who?" he asked. She looked up at him then, her eyes hollowed by something ancient. "For anyone who remembered how to listen." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from weight, as if she had carried this burden alone for too long. And now it was spilling out with the storm. She spoke of a man who rode west with greed in his blood and fire at his back. She spoke of dreams that weren't dreams, of wolves with human voices and rivers that ran backward. She said her own people once told her to leave a place before it turned to ash, but she had waited too long, thinking she could change it, thinking her message might arrive before the ruin did. "They called it madness," she said, "but it was memory, memory deeper than time." Samuel sat still, letting her words settle. He didn't ask if it was true. He didn't need to. Truth, he'd come to learn, didn't always need proof. Sometimes it just needed a place to land. The fire flickered lower, casting longer shadows. Outside, the storm began to drift, its rage spent. But inside the barn, the world felt different, like the very air had bent around her story. Tiva drew her knees to her chest, her face tired yet calm. "They thought silence would bury me," she said, barely above a whisper. "But fire always remembers." And with that, she closed her eyes. Samuel watched her breathe, slow and steady. He didn't move. He just stared into the fire, and for the first time in a long while, he understood that the past wasn't behind them. It had just been waiting for the right moment to speak, and now it had. Morning light crept across the rafters like a blessing, soft and golden after the violent storm. The air smelled of wet earth and charred pine, the kind of scent that only follows after fire has passed, but left something important standing. Samuel stepped outside with a mug of coffee, letting the steam touch his face, and thought about what she'd said the night before. They thought silence would bury me, but fire always remembers. He found himself turning those words over and over again, like they held more than meaning. Like they were a key he hadn't yet found the lock for. She was still asleep in the hayloft, curled beneath that old woven blanket, the one she'd come wrapped in, like a ghost from a different century. It was faded with use, stitched with patterns he couldn't decipher, swirls and peaks, something between art and memory. Samuel had seen plenty of old things, but this one carried a different kind of weight. It wasn't worn out, it was worn in, like it had traveled far and refused to forget where it came from. He didn't mean to intrude, not really. He was cleaning up the barn, sorting tools, folding canvas, brushing debris from the hay. And the blanket had slipped from her side, part of it dragging down the ladder as if calling to him. He lifted it gently, about to fold it, when his fingers caught on something odd. A stiffness in the seam, a thickness not from thread, but from paper. Curious, he carried it over to the light by the barn door, sat down, and began to examine the lining. Carefully, reverently, he eased the stitches apart with his knife, just enough to pull free a thin, creased envelope. It was old, the paper yellowed, but still intact. His name wasn't on it. No name was. He turned it over and paused when he saw the seal, broken now, but once marked with a cross. The kind missionaries used when they traveled west with their Torah on their Bibles and notebooks, hungry to save souls they didn't yet understand. He unfolded the letter with steady hands. The ink had faded, but the words remained. She carries the truth of the hills. Let her speak when she chooses. Do not force the fire to burn before its time. Sister Annabelle R. March, St. Elia's Mission, 1866. Samuel read it twice, then a third time. The truth of the hills? A fire not to be forced. He looked toward the loft, where Tiva still slept, bathed in the last light of dawn. And something inside him shifted. She hadn't come to him by accident, and she wasn't just a lost woman hiding from a broken world. There was a thread, long and winding, that ran from her past to his doorstep. And now he held part of it in his hands. He tucked the letter into his coat pocket and spent the rest of the morning watching her from a distance, not with suspicion, but with awe. She moved differently now, with purpose, as if the storm had shaken loose something in her. Later that day, as the sun warmed the damp earth, Samuel found her seated outside the barn beneath the shade of an old elm, a small knife in one hand and a block of pine in the other. She carved slowly, silently, the same way she did everything, with intent. He expected animals, maybe symbols or faces, like the old native carvings passed down through generations. But what emerged wasn't any of that. Lines, straight and deliberate, curves that followed no creature's form, dots, rivers, peaks. He crouched beside her, watching the blade glide with precision. "What is it?" he asked. Tiva didn't look up. "Not what?" she murmured. "Where?" He tilted his head, examining the wooden surface. It was a map, or part of one. She finished the piece with a final cut, then picked up another block and began again. Another map, but slightly different. The river curved east this time, and the peaks were closer together. He watched in silence as she worked, each carving a puzzle, each mark deliberate. She wasn't making art. She was remembering. "Tiva," he said slowly, "are you looking for something?" Her hands paused. The knife stopped mid-motion. Then, quietly, "Someone." She didn't say who. She didn't need to. Samuel leaned back, the weight of the day pressing deeper into his bones. The old letter in his coat pocket pulsed like a heartbeat. Let her speak when she chooses. He didn't know who Sister Annabelle had been, but she'd known Tiva, and she'd seen something in her, something true enough to hide, and strong enough to protect. That night, the two of them sat again by the fire. No storm this time, just the chirping of crickets and the whisper of wind through the brush. The stars blinked above like eyes that had seen too much. Tiva didn't speak, but she didn't need to. Her carvings rested beside her, laid out like breadcrumbs. Samuel stared at the flames and asked softly, "Will you know when you find them?" Tiva looked at him, then past him, toward the hills. "I'll feel it," she whispered, "in my bones." And Samuel, watching the firelight dance across her face, knew something else for certain now. She hadn't come to the ranch to be saved. She had come here to remember. The sky was turning the color of blood, oranges, and rust when Samuel spotted movement along the ridge. At first, it was just shadows against the fading light. 3 figures on horseback, silent and still as the dusk settled over the hills like smoke. He lowered the axe he'd been using to split firewood and narrowed his eyes. The horses were bare-legged and sure-footed. The riders upright and silent. No dust trail. No sound but the creak of saddles and the slow rhythm of hooves on dry earth. Samuel didn't wait. His instincts were old and sharp, forged in the kind of solitude that teaches a man to listen to what the wind doesn't say. He stepped inside the cabin, took the rifle from the wall, and checked the chamber. Loaded. His heart ticked a little faster, but not from fear, from memory. You didn't live this far out without knowing who rode with peace and who rode with knives. Tiva appeared in the doorway before he could step back out. Her hair loose, her feet bare, her eyes already searching the hills. "You see them?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded once. "Apache?" Another nod. He moved past her, cradling the rifle in one hand, and stepped out onto the porch. The figures were closer now. 20 paces, maybe less. 3 men, faces marked by wind and sun, bone necklaces at their throats, feathers woven into their braids. No signs of aggression, no war paint, but no smiles either. He raised the rifle halfway, enough to mean business but not war. Then he felt it, soft fingers on his forearm. Tiva had come beside him, her hand light but firm. "Don't," she said. He looked at her. There was no fear in her voice, just gravity. Her eyes stayed locked on the riders, and he saw something shift in her, like a curtain rising on a stage he'd never seen before. This was not the quiet woman who carved maps in the shade. This was someone standing on the edge of something ancient. The riders halted in front of the porch. The tallest dismounted, his moccasins whispering against the dirt as he stepped forward. He looked at Samuel, then at Tiva. Then he reached into the small leather pouch tied to his belt and pulled out a pendant, a circle of bone strung on sinew, marked with a symbol Samuel didn't recognize. He held it out, wordless. Tiva stepped forward and took it gently in her hands. For a moment, the world went quiet. Even the wind held its breath. She stared at the pendant as if it were a mirror. Then the warrior spoke. Samuel didn't understand the words. They were low, guttural, heavy with meaning. But Tiva responded in the same language, her voice steady, the syllables wrapping around the air like smoke. They spoke for less than a minute. Then silence returned. The warrior nodded once, not to Samuel, but to her. Then he turned, climbed back onto his horse, and the three of them rode off into the deepening dusk without another word. No farewells, no threats. Only the sound of hooves receding into the falling dark. Samuel stood still, rifle slack in his hand, trying to make sense of it. Tiva remained quiet until the riders vanished over the ridge. Then she turned to him, her hand still holding the pendant. "They came for me," she said. Samuel felt the breath catch in his chest. "But I'm not leaving." He didn't speak, just looked at her, really looked at her, as the last light of the sun bled away behind her. The pendant dangled from her fingers, swinging gently like a compass needle, unsure of which way to point. "You knew them?" he asked finally. She nodded. "They're scouts, from a band my mother once called kin." He looked at the pendant. "What does it mean?" She turned it over in her hand. "It's not just a sign. It's a summons. They were sent to bring me back. Someone thinks I still carry the message." Samuel's brow furrowed. "Message?" She didn't answer right away, just stared into the horizon where the riders had disappeared. "There's a place," she said quietly, "beyond the southern ridge, where the hills break into red rock canyons. My father said it was once sacred ground. Then settlers took it, dug it out, built over it, said they owned it." Samuel didn't interrupt. "A long time ago," she continued, "a group of women were entrusted to carry stories, not spoken ones, not even written, stories mapped in memory, passed through carving, song, and dream. I was one of them, chosen too young maybe, or maybe just in time." "And you left?" he asked. "I was hidden," she said, "after the raids, after the burning. The ones who survived didn't want the message to die with them. But I was too young to understand it then." She looked at the pendant again. "They think I understand it now." Samuel stepped closer, lowering the rifle all the way. "Do you?" She gave him a long look, eyes reflecting firelight now dancing from the cabin window. "Maybe," she whispered. "Or maybe I just know where to start looking." That night, the land fell into silence again. The sky inked over with stars, and no more riders appeared. Samuel couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch, the rifle leaning against the wall, watching the darkness as if it might speak. Inside, Tiva lay awake as well, the pendant clutched in her palm, its weight both a question and a vow. Whatever the message was, it hadn't died in fire, and neither had she. The days began to blend together after the riders disappeared, soft-edged and golden, like memories still being made. The land didn't change. The hills stood the same, the pines whispered their secrets in the wind, and the creek still traced its silver line through the earth. But something was different, and Samuel felt it in the space between each breath. It was her. Tiva no longer moved like a shadow inside the cabin. She took up space now, not with noise, but with presence. She'd begun to hum while gathering herbs or cooking, soft melodies that Samuel couldn't place, but which sank into the walls like warmth after a hard frost. She laughed sometimes too, not loudly, never brash, but often. Quiet amused chuckles that caught Samuel off guard, like the sudden song of a bird you'd forgotten lived nearby. She carved every afternoon now, not in secret, not with a guarded look over her shoulder, but right there on the front porch beside him. The figures had changed. No longer maps of land or escape routes through hidden valleys, but scenes, little tableaus of people, animals, even dreams. Once she showed him a piece that looked like a group of women dancing beneath the moon. Another time, a hawk soaring over broken hills. Samuel didn't ask what they meant. He'd learned not to chase her meanings. She gave what she wanted when she chose. And somehow, that made every offering feel sacred. He still chopped wood, still repaired the barn, still mended the fence when the wind knocked it loose. But now, he did it knowing someone would be there when he came back, someone who set out 2 cups instead of 1, someone who lit the fire before sunset, someone who didn't fill the silence with talk, but filled it all the same. One crisp morning, as mist curled around the treetops and the air smelled faintly of wet pine and cinnamon tea, Samuel opened the cabin door to find something waiting on the step. It was a small leather pouch, hand-stitched with sinew, dyed with berry ink. A medicine pouch. He stared at it for a long moment before picking it up, almost afraid of what it might mean. Then he stepped inside, sat at the table, and slowly untied the drawstring. Inside was a small wooden figure, no taller than his thumb. Carved with care, the lines smoothed and burnished by careful fingers. It was him. The broad shoulders, the tilt of the hat, even the scar along his cheek. But he wasn't alone. Next to him stood another figure. A woman, hair falling in long braids, chin tilted up, one hand resting against his arm. Tiva. He held it in his palm for a long time, his fingers curling around the tiny figures like a prayer. When he looked up, she was standing in the doorway, watching. "You made this?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She nodded. His throat tightened. "Why?" Her eyes didn't waver. "Because it's true." He wanted to speak, something poetic, something to match the moment, but the words didn't come. Instead, he stood, walked to her, and placed the carving gently on the table between them. "You're not leaving," he said. "No," she replied. "You could have," he added. "When they came for you, you could have gone back." She stepped closer, so close he could feel the heat of her skin. "They came to remind me who I was," she said softly. "You reminded me who I want to be." He closed his eyes for a moment. The wind moved through the trees like breath. Somewhere in the hills, a hawk cried out, echoing through the morning air. He opened his eyes again. "I thought I was buying the last Apache woman," he said, voice barely more than a whisper. She reached up, touched his chest, right over his heart. "But you didn't know," she finished for him. "You were finding the last piece of yourself." They stood like that for a while. No need to move, no need to speak further. The carving sat between them, a quiet testimony to what neither of them had expected, but both had grown into. Slowly, like roots beneath dry earth, waiting for the right rain to bloom. Weeks passed after that, and the land carried on. The snow would come soon. The wind grew colder each evening. But there was warmth now. Inside the cabin, inside the man, inside the woman who had once been silent. Sometimes Samuel would find her standing on the ridge at dawn. Her face turned to the sun, the pendant from the Apache scouts hanging from her neck like a secret not yet spoken. She never said what she saw out there. He never asked. Some truths didn't need naming. Other times she'd walk behind him as he worked, or sit by the fire stitching new linings into old coats. He watched the way her hands moved, steady, purposeful, and wondered how he'd ever lived without their presence in his world. He didn't call it love, not out loud. He wasn't sure she would have liked that word, but he called it home. And it felt like enough. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills and painted the sky with flames, he found the little carving on the mantel. Tiva had placed it there beside the lantern, where it caught the light just right. He stood there staring at it, letting the silence wash over him. Two figures, side by side. Not perfect, not finished, but together. And that finally was everything.